Well, welcome everyone to The Catholic Reason, a radio production of St. Michael Radio based in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, where we think through various claims made by the Catholic Church concerning issues of faith, morality, and culture, and provide reasons behind those claims. My name is Karlo Broussard. I'm a staff apologist and speaker for Catholic Answers, and a member of the Chancery Evangelization team at the Diocese of Tulsa and Eastern Oklahoma. The Catholic Reason airs locally here in Tulsa every Thursday from 4 to 5 p.m. on St. Michael Catholic Radio, 94.9 and 102.9. But you may be listening on your own local Catholic radio station at a different time, since The Catholic Reason is now aired on other Catholic stations throughout the country. So if you're listening outside the Tulsa area, welcome and thanks for joining me. Just to let you know, you can download the show through whichever podcast platform you use by subscribing to the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast. You can also access the archived episodes at karlobroussard.com under the audio tab. And also, too, one last thing, if you'd like to submit a question for me to answer on the air in a future episode, you can do so by emailing me at Karlo, that's K-A-R-L-O, my first name, Karlo at stmichaelradio.com. So that's Karlo at stmichaelradio.com. All right, so I'd like to kick things off in today's episode with the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It teaches that Christ instituted Peter as, quote-unquote, the head of the College of the Apostles in paragraph 880. And therefore that the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, Peter's successor as the Bishop of Rome, quote, is the perpetual and visible source and foundation of the unity, both of the bishops and of the whole company of the faith. That's sort of the Catechism's definition of the papacy, right? The perpetual and visible source and foundation of the unity, both of the bishops and of the whole company of the faith. That's paragraph 882, by the way. But our Protestant brothers and sisters argue that the Bible teaches otherwise. And what I mean by that is that notice the Catholic claim is that the Bishop of Rome is the Pope, the head of the College of the Apostles, because he is Peter's successor as the Bishop of Rome. The implication being that Peter was the first Pope, i.e., the first perpetual and visible source and foundation of the unity, both of the apostles and the whole company of the faithful. But our Protestant friends think that the Bible teaches otherwise, namely that Peter was not the first Pope. And we're going to look at two arguments in today's episode that Protestants put forward to this end. There are more, and we're going to look at some other arguments in a future episode, maybe perhaps even next week. We'll see how things go. But the two arguments that I would like to look at today are, one, James led the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15, not Peter. The conclusion being that Peter was not the first pope, given that James was leading the council. The argument being that if Peter were the first pope, then he would be the one leading the council, but since he was not the one leading the council, so the argument goes, therefore Peter was not the first pope. That's the first argument. James led the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15, not Peter. The second argument, that Peter was not the first pope, or you might say a second challenge to Peter being the first pope in the Bible, is that the New Testament doesn't mention the Petrine office when it would have been pertinent to do so. Now, I deal with this particular challenge in my article at Catholic.com, quote, the title is Petrine Hiddenness in the New Testament. Petrine hiddenness in the New Testament does not undermine the papacy. That's the name of the article. The first challenge I actually deal with in my book, Meeting the Protestant Challenge. So I'm going to pull from my book, Meeting the Protestant Challenge and Meeting the First Challenge, namely James led the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15, and then I'll be pulling from my article at Catholic.com to meet that second challenge. The New Testament doesn't mention the Petrine office when it would have been pertinent to do so. Okay, so let's start with the first challenge. We'll probably get through a couple of answers in response to the challenge, and we'll have to pick up on the other side of the break. We'll see how far we can get here. But the first challenge, again, is that James led the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15. The council was convened due to an early church debate over how a person is to be saved. According to Acts 15:1, some of the Jewish converts to Christianity were teaching that circumcision was necessary for salvation. Luke, the author of Acts, tells us that Paul and Barnabas, quote, had no small dissension and debate with them, that is, with those who were claiming you had to be circumcised to be saved. That's in Acts 15:2. And that in order to settle the question, Luke tells us they were appointed to go and meet with the apostles and elders in Jerusalem. In other words, they had to convene in a council in order to consider the matter. Now, some of our Protestant friends, appealing to Acts 15, argue that James the Just, aka the Lord's brother, was in charge of the council, proving that Peter could not have been the head of the early church as the first pope. And there are a few Protestant sources, Protestants who argue for this, the late Norman Geisler and Ralph McKenzie, and their book, Roman Catholics and Evangelicals, Agreements and Differences. They make this challenge. Norman Geisler and Joshua Bentoncourt in the book, Is Rome the True Church? Consideration of the Roman Catholic Claim. And then also Kenneth Collins and Jerry Walls in their book, Roman but Not Catholic, What Remains at Stake 500 Years After the the Reformation. These are three Protestant sources that make this challenge in the appeal to Acts 15 and saying James led the council. Now, Protestant apologist James White in his book, The Roman Catholic Controversy, makes this challenge as well. But I'm going to focus on him because he provides two lines of evidence to try and justify the claim that James was leading the council and not Peter. And he points to James' use of the imperative mood for listen in verse 13. The Greek there is akouo as proof for this. Brethren, listen, Greek akousate, to me, James says. And so White argues, given that the imperative mood is used, it signifies that James was issuing a command and thus revealing that he's the one in charge of and leading the council. The second line of evidence that White appeals to is that James decides the results of the council in verse 19 when he says, quote, therefore my judgment is that we should not trouble those of the Gentiles who turn to God. And so White argues, given that James is deciding the results of the council and stating it's his judgment to do these things, X, Y, Z, and they go on to list the certain precepts to impose upon the Gentiles, that reveals James is at the helm of the council there in Acts 15. So how do we respond to this challenge? Well, first of all, let's address the argument from the imperative mood here, that first line of evidence that White proposes as proving James was leading the council. And the response is that the imperative mood for akouo doesn't necessarily connote authority over the group. Imagine that everyone is throwing around ideas in a business meeting. And then you say, listen, guys, and then you go on to share your ideas. This doesn't necessarily mean that you're in charge of the meeting. You may be simply trying to get the others there to pay attention to what you have to say. I mean, imagine, all of us apologists at Catholic Answers are in a conference room throwing around ideas and it's kind of getting rowdy. And I say, hey, guys, listen. And then I give my opinion. That doesn't mean that I somehow now am the CEO and Chris Check is no longer the CEO of Catholic Answers. Well, this is how the imperative of akouo is used later in Acts 22:1, where Paul says to his Jewish brethren and fathers, hear, Greek there, akousate, the defense which I now make before you. Paul wasn't exercising authority over the group here. He merely was asking for their undivided attention to hear what he had to say. And the following verse in Acts 22, verse 2, bears this out. Quote, and when they heard that he addressed them in the Hebrew language, they were the more quiet. Given that the imperative mood of akouo doesn't necessarily connote authority, its use in Acts 15 doesn't establish that James had authority over the council proceedings. Context must be taken into consideration in order to determine the force of the imperative. So what does the context tell us? Well, we can move to other ways of meeting the challenge and see. And this brings us to the second response. Peter is the one who speaks first and settles the substance of the debate. Luke sets up Peter's speech by highlighting the tension among the apostles and the presbyters there in Acts 15, verse 6. Quote, there was much debate, Luke tells us. And subsequent verses reveal that it was Peter's speech that settles the debate. He says, brethren, you know that in the early days God made choice among you, that by my mouth the Gentiles should hear the word of the gospel and believe. And God, who knows the heart, bore witness to them, giving them the Holy Spirit, just as he did to us. And he made no distinction between us and them, but cleansed their hearts by faith. We believe that we shall be saved through the grace of our Lord Jesus, just as they will. That's verses 7 through 11 of Acts 15. And this all happens before James rises and requests the assembly to listen to his words there in verse 13. James does direct the council proceedings after Peter's speech, but it's Peter who speaks first and settles the debate. And in verse 14, James even recognizes as much. Simeon has related as how God first visited the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name. So consider this. If James had just as much authority over the group as Peter, or more, well, then he would have been the one to take the initiative and settle the substance of the debate, not Peter. But of course, James does not take the initiative. He is not the one who takes the initiative and settles the substance of the debate. And so therefore, James did not have just as much authority over the group as Peter. He did not have more authority than Peter. So given that Peter takes the initiative, and it's Peter who settles the substance of the debate, which had to do with how a man is saved, that reveals to us that Peter is the one who is exercising a supreme authority at the council in the council proceedings, not James. So Peter's at the helm, not James. Now, we began to respond. We've offered two answers to this challenge. The first of all is that the first answer was targeting specifically that line of evidence that the imperative mood of akuo is used, which is the Greek for listen. And we showed that just because the imperative is used, that doesn't mean that James has supreme authority at the council proceedings, that he's in charge and he's at the helm, since the imperative can be utilized in such a way just to get people's attention, for them to hear what you got to say, as opposed to exercising some sort of leadership role or supreme authority. And then secondly, the second answer we gave was that Peter is actually the one who speaks first and settles the substance of the debate, not James. James only rises and makes his proposals and gives his speech after Peter has already settled the theological debate as to whether folks need to get circumcised in order to be saved. And so that was our second response, thereby revealing that Peter actually was exercising a supreme authority over and above James, since if James were leading the council in sort of the popish way, right? If James was the one who was exercising supreme authority, he would have been the one to take the initiative and settle the dispute. Since he doesn't, and Peter does, that reveals to us that James has a subordinate rank of authority to Peter there. Now, a third response, or a third way to meet this challenge is that James's speech is pastoral. It's a pastoral proposal, whereas Peter's speech is a doctrinal declaration. And this further illustrates the distinction between the authority that Peter is exercising at the council and the authority that James is exercising. The content of Peter's speech was a matter of divine revelation. It was God who chose to reveal that the Gentiles could be saved. For he had given them the Holy Spirit just as he did the apostles, cleansing their hearts by faith and making no distinction between the circumcised and the uncircumcised, as Peter says in Acts 15, 8-9. Now, based on that revelation, Peter makes a doctrinal statement that's more than mere opinion. Notice in Acts 15, verse 11, Peter says, we believe that we shall be saved through the grace of the Lord Jesus, just as they, the Gentiles, will. Peter doesn't offer this view as what he thinks should be believed. He offers it as what is believed. And notice he speaks on behalf of the church. We believe. We believe. He doesn't just say, I believe, this is my opinion. He's speaking on behalf of the whole church. We believe this. Now, James's speech stands in stark contrast with Peter's. First, It was, for the most part, pastoral in nature, intended to address the problem of how to unify Jewish and Gentile Christians. And you can look to Acts 15, 1 through 5 for that. It's a practical problem that only arises because of the theological issue already settled by Peter. Gentile converts were coming into a community of Jewish Christians who were still holding fast to many of the Old Testament precepts and Jewish laws. And you can check out Acts 21, 15 through 26 for some evidence of that. And in order to keep the Gentiles from offending Jewish sensibilities, James proposes that the Gentile converts adhere to certain precepts that Jewish converts would have considered it scandalous to violate. And so we see this in Acts 15, 19. So, for example, abstinence from the pollutions of idols, and from unchastity, and from what is strangled, and from blood. Of these 4 precepts, only one is of a moral nature, namely unchastity, in Greek there porneia, which may refer to invalid marital unions that the Gentiles contracted before becoming Christian. So 3 of those 4 precepts are pastoral in nature, which stands in stark contrast to what Peter declared, namely the divine revelation, the revelation of God as to how a man is to be saved. Now, James's speech also stands in contrast to Peter's because, unlike Peter, who stated what is the case, James offers his ideas for consideration. Notice the tone in verses 19 through 20, which is a line of evidence that White appeals to in order to justify his claim that James is leading the council, not Peter. But rather, this particular verse illustrates to us that James is exercising a lesser degree of authority than what Peter is. So here's what James says in Acts 15, 19 through 20. Therefore, my judgment is that we should not trouble those of the Gentiles who turn to God, but should write to them. Now, James White appeals to James's use of my judgment, the Greek word there, krino, as evidence for James exercising an authority over and above Peter, that Peter was not leading the council and exercising a supreme authority. But the Greek word translated judgment there, krino, means to hold a view or have an opinion with regard to something, to hold a view, to have an opinion, to consider, to regard. So even this verse itself, James is offering his proposal, the pastoral proposal, a proposal that's pastoral in nature, as an opinion for the apostles and the elders there, the presbyters, to consider. And that stands in stark contrast to Peter, who says, this is the case. He declares what is the case. We're saved, the Gentiles are saved by grace through faith, not through circumcision. James offers his opinion for them to consider. And so that illustrates to us that James is exercising a lesser degree. He is taking some leadership role here in the council proceedings, but he is exercising a lesser degree of authority than what Peter exercises in verses 7 through 11 when he declares what is God's revelation. And so we have 3 ways of meeting this challenge from Acts chapter 15. Recall, the challenge states James is the one who led the council in Jerusalem, not Peter. And then in response, we can say, well, targeting specifically that line of evidence that appeals to the imperative mood of akuo, and saying just because the imperative mood of akuo is used, when James says, listen to me, that doesn't mean he's exercising a supreme authority over the group. So that was our first response. Secondly, we said Peter is the one who actually speaks first. He's the one who takes the initiative and settles the substance of the debate, not James, thereby revealing Peter is the one exercising a supreme authority, a higher degree of authority, even over and above James. And then thirdly, James's speech is pastoral in nature, in contrast to Peter's declaration, which had to do with the divine revelation, and also James's proposal was pastoral in nature, in contrast to Peter's declaration, which again had to do with divine revelation. So that contrast there is Peter's speech is a declaration, James's speech is a proposal. Peter's declaration had to do with divine revelation. James's proposal has to do with things of pastoral precepts to keep Jewish and Gentile peace within the first century church. Okay, so that completes the first challenge, the challenge from the Council of Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15. Let's now move, in the little time that we have here before our second break, to the second challenge that we'll be looking at in today's episode. And this challenge should take up the rest of today's episode, and that is the New Testament never mentions the Petrine office when it would have been pertinent to do so. And so here's the challenge in an argument form, and this would be a modus tollens argument here. Premise one: if Peter was the first pope, like Catholics say he was, then the New Testament would mention such a Petrine office when it would have been pertinent to do so. Premise two: but since it doesn't, therefore the conclusion: Peter must not have been the first pope. Now, again, as I said at the outset of this episode, I deal with this particular challenge in my article at Catholic.com entitled Petrine Hiddenness and the New Testament Does Not Undermine the Papacy. So you can check it out if you want to read it there. Now, there are a few common places in the New Testament where some Protestants turn to in order to make this argument. First of all, Paul's list of different ministries in the church. In 1 Corinthians 12:28, God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then workers of miracles, then healers, helpers, administrators, speakers, and various kinds of tongues. And so the argument is, nowhere does Paul refer here to the papacy. And it would have been pertinent for him to do so because he's listing apostles, prophets, teachers, etc. And in fact, Paul identifies the apostles, not Peter, so the argument goes, as the first order of ministers. If Peter were the first pope, you would think Paul would be listing Peter here first, not apostles, generally speaking. They also appeal to Paul's letter to the Romans. Paul never mentions the papacy. He never says anything about Peter in association with the Church of Rome. And he references the preaching of the gospel to the Church of Rome in Romans 1:15, which Protestants argue suggests that Paul didn't believe Peter was already the Bishop of Rome. And then finally, they appeal to Paul's farewell address in 2 Timothy 4:6-11, where Paul identifies many that have deserted him and affirms, Luke alone is with me, Paul says. If Peter were the Bishop of Rome, so the argument goes, well, then Paul would not have said that only Luke remained with him. In today's episode, we're looking at Protestant challenges to Peter as the first pope, two in particular. The first of which is James was the leader of the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15, not Peter. We gave some ways in which we can meet that challenge to show that Peter actually was at the helm at the Council of Jerusalem. James did have a leadership role in some of the proceedings of the council, but it was Peter who took the initiative to settle the theological debate as to what constituted God's revelation, thereby revealing his supreme authority over James, exercising a higher degree of authority over James and all of the other apostles and elders convened at the council, including Paul and Barnabas. And then the second challenge is that the New Testament never mentions the Petrine office when it would have been pertinent to do so. And before our last break, we started setting up this challenge. The argument going, if Peter were the first pope like Catholics say he was, then the New Testament would mention such a Petrine office when it would have been pertinent to do so. But the New Testament doesn't, and so therefore Peter must not have been the first pope. And I was trying to articulate, I guess you could say, 5 different reasons why Protestants, or 5 different, let me state it like this, 5 different places in the New Testament where Protestants look to say, hey, if Peter were the first pope, Paul would have mentioned, the Petrine office would have been mentioned there. And this all has to do basically with Paul. So the first target would be, or the first place would be Paul's list of different ministries in the church in 1 Corinthians 12, Paul's lack of reference to the office of the papacy in his letter to the Romans, Paul's lack of address to Peter in association with the Church of Rome in his letter to the Romans, Paul's message about preaching the gospel to the Church of Rome in Romans 1:15 suggests that he didn't believe Peter was the Bishop of Rome. And then fifthly, Paul's comment that only Luke remained with him in his last days there in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 6-11. So 5 distinct places, 5, I guess you could say 5 reasons why Protestants think that Peter was not the first pope, or 5 places where it would have been pertinent for Paul to mention the Petrine office, but it's not. So let's take that first place. Paul's list of different ministries in the church there in 1 Corinthians 12. In response, we could say this: the logic leads to unfavorable consequences. If we were to follow the logic of the challenge concerning Paul's list of the different ministries in the church, well, then we would have to conclude there are no presbyters, no bishops, and no deacons in the church, since Paul also fails to mention these as existing ministries in the same passage of 1 Corinthians 12:28. But yet we know such ministries existed. Presbyters, according to Acts 15:6, bishops in 1 Timothy 3:1, and deacons according to 1 Timothy 3:8 through 10. Therefore, Paul's failure to mention Peter's unique role as pope when listing ministries in the church isn't evidence against it. Again, if we follow the logic embedded in the challenge, it's going to lead to unfavorable consequences. Secondly, Paul provides a similar list of ministries in Romans 12, and he actually leaves out some of the ministries that he listed in 1 Corinthians 12. Here's what he writes in Romans 12:6 through 8. Having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them. If prophecy in proportion to our faith, if service in our serving, he who teaches in his teaching, he who exhorts in his exhortation, he who contributes in liberality, he who gives aid with zeal, he who does acts of mercy with cheerfulness. Notice Paul doesn't mention apostles here, nor does he mention workers of miracles, healers, administrators, or speakers of various tongues, all of which he mentions in 1 Corinthians 12. And some of the ministries he lists here in Romans 12, he leaves out in 1 Corinthians 12. He who exhorts, he who does acts of mercy, etc. This reveals to us that Paul didn't intend these lists to be exhaustive. And since Paul wasn't trying to be exhaustive in his list of the ministries in the church, his lack of mentioning the Petrine office, that Peter is the chief royal steward, is not evidence against it. So we have good, solid reasons to think that Paul's lack of mentioning the Petrine office in 1 Corinthians 12:28 is evidence against the Petrine office. Let me restate that. We have good reason to think that Paul's lack of mentioning the Petrine office in 1 Corinthians 12:28 is not evidence against the Petrine office. Okay, now the second target, I guess you could say, or the second place that Protestants appeal to in saying it would have been pertinent for Paul to mention the Petrine office, but he doesn't, and that is Paul's letter to the Romans. Paul, so the argument goes, doesn't have any reference to the office of the papacy in his letter to the Romans. And so that, so it's argued, would seem to count against the Petrine ministry. But we beg to differ. So first of all, consider that Paul's letters were restrictive in nature. They weren't meant to deal with everything that pertains to the Christian faith. As such, Paul's failure to mention the papacy can't be evidence against it. We have a reasonable expectation that the Petrine office might not be a part of that letter because the letter is restrictive in nature and not intended to deal with everything that pertains to the Christian faith. Furthermore, and here's a second response, much of the content that makes up Paul's letters is ordered to dealing with issues that caused strife in the local churches. Silence about the papacy in Paul's letter to the Romans could be due to the simple fact that Peter's role as the first pope was not an issue that needed to be dealt with. Paul didn't have to speak to the Christians in Rome concerning that particular issue because that was not an issue of debate. It was not an issue or a source of conflict and division, and so Paul didn't have to deal with it. And so for these two reasons, we can say that Paul's lack of reference to the office of the papacy in his letter to the Romans does not count against the Petrine office. All right, now, some Protestants will argue that the lack of address to Peter in association with the Church of Rome is evidence against the Petrine office. Paul never mentions Peter in association with the Church of Rome. You would think that if Peter were the Bishop of Rome, Paul would have addressed him in his letter. right? And that seems like a pretty persuasive argument on the surface, on its face value. Paul's writing a letter to the Romans, and if Peter's the Bishop of Rome, you would think he would address Peter in that letter, right? Not only that he does not mention the Petrine office, but he doesn't even address Peter. That's the argument here. Now, how do we respond? Well, the problem with this objection is that it assumes the only reason Paul wouldn't address Peter is if he's not the Bishop of Rome. But it's possible Paul doesn't address him for other reasons. So here's one possible reason. Perhaps Peter wasn't the Bishop of Rome yet and wouldn't hold this apostolic see until sometime after Paul's letter, which was written around AD 54. Although the historical evidence doesn't seem to support this, it at least provides an alternative explanation as to why Paul wouldn't address Peter without denying the fact that Peter was the Bishop of Rome at the time Paul penned his letter. So the idea here is, just because Paul does not address Peter in this letter, it doesn't follow that Peter was never the Bishop of Rome and did not have a unique authority. There is an alternative explanation here as to why Paul would not address Peter. And so the lack of the address is not evidence against Peter as the Bishop of Rome. Another possible reason is that Peter wasn't in Rome due to his apostolic travels. In other words, Paul just might not have been addressing Peter because Peter wasn't there. We know from Peter's first letter that he traveled throughout various regions in Turkey, Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, according to 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1. Paul's correspondence with the Corinthians reveals that Peter also ministered in Corinth for some time during his ministry. And you can check that out in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 12, chapter 3, verse 22, and chapter 9, verse 5, and chapter 15, verse 5. Therefore, it's possible that Paul doesn't address Peter because Peter wasn't there due to his apostolic travels. So, given that we have plausible alternative explanations as to why Paul doesn't address Peter in his letter to the Romans, we can conclude that Paul's lack of address is not evidence necessarily against Peter being the Bishop of Rome. And so a Protestant could not appeal to this lack of address as a challenge to Peter as the first pope. Okay, so now we can go to our fourth target, or the fourth lack of evidence, right? Petrine hiddenness. And so some Protestants will say that Paul's message about the preaching of the gospel to the Church of Rome in Romans 1:15 suggests that Paul didn't believe Peter was the Bishop of Rome. And Romans 1:15 there reads, let's see if we can, we'll pull it up real quick. I thought I was going to have it. I didn't have it right away, but I'll just pull it up right here. Here's what Romans 15. So I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. And so some Protestants will argue that that is evidence that Paul did not believe Peter was the Bishop of Rome. And we've been looking at a second challenge, and that is the New Testament never mentions the Petrine office when it would have been pertinent to do so. And we've looked at 3 examples already. Paul's list of the different ministries in the church in 1 Corinthians 12. Protestants argue Paul's lack of reference to the Petrine office there proves Peter wasn't the first pope, but we gave some answers in response to that. The second target being Paul's lack of reference to the office of the papacy in his letter to the Romans. Like he doesn't even mention the office of the papacy, so it's argued in his letter to the Romans. And then third, Paul doesn't even address Peter in his letter to the Romans, doesn't even associate Peter with the Church of Rome. And so that would seem to be evidence against Peter being the first pope. And we gave some responses to that challenge. Now, before our last break, we started teeing up a fourth target, you might say, or a fourth sub-argument, and that is Paul's message about preaching the gospel to the Church of Rome in Romans 1:15 would seem to suggest he didn't believe Peter was the Bishop of Rome. But in response, we can actually appeal to Romans 15:19 through 22, where Paul seems to actually suggests that Peter was already the Bishop of Rome. And here's what he writes: "From Jerusalem and as far around as Illyricum, I have fully preached the gospel of Christ, thus making it my ambition to preach the gospel, not where Christ has already been named, lest I build on another man's foundation. This is the reason why I have so often been hindered from coming to you." The implication here is that Christ's name had already been preached in Rome. This is why he didn't preach in Rome initially like he did in the other places. And it wasn't preached just by a group of Christians, perhaps Christian Jews who returned to Rome after the Feast of Pentecost in Acts 2. Rather, Paul asserts an individual preached Christ's name. Recall, lest I build on another man's foundation. This is why Paul busied himself with preaching the gospel in other places besides Rome. Again, in verse 20 there, "From Jerusalem and as far around as Illyricum." Now, this individual couldn't have been Paul, since he's talking about another man's foundation. That's obvious. Moreover, Paul had not been to Rome yet. He writes in verse 23, "I have longed for many years to come to you." So, whom could Paul be referring to as the one whose foundation he didn't want to build upon? Well, if we turn to the historical evidence, it's Peter. We know from extra biblical sources that Peter was involved in founding the Church of Rome. Here's what St. Irenaeus writes in his work Against Heresies, Book 3, Chapter 3. "We put to confusion," he writes, "all those who assemble in unauthorized meetings by indicating that tradition derived from the apostles of the very great, the very ancient, and universally known church founded and organized at Rome by the two most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul." If Peter is said to be involved in the founding of the Church of Rome, and Paul implies that he is not the one who did it here in Romans 15:20, well then the other man spoken of by Paul in Romans 15:20 must have been Peter. There's another way to make a reasonable inference to the same conclusion. Consider that the person Paul has in mind as having already preached Christ's name to the Christians in Rome is likely to have been an apostle, since Paul views this other man as having the same apostolic status as himself. If this man were of a lower status, well, then Paul wouldn't be concerned about treading on his evangelistic groundwork. Also, we know Rome was a place with a large Jewish population before Claudius expelled them in AD 49. So whomever Paul has in mind here most likely would have been a prominent evangelist interested in evangelizing Jews. Well, friends, Peter is the only apostle other than Paul that fits that description. And Peter's specific mission was to minister to the circumcised. According to Galatians 2, 7 through 9, Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised. Peter, therefore, is the most reasonable referent of Paul's statement in Romans 15:20. And so Paul actually does seem to give us evidence that he recognizes Peter to be the Bishop of Rome, the one who has founded that church. And so rather than there being a lack of a reference, even though a lack of a reference doesn't lead to the conclusion that Peter was not the Bishop of Rome and thereby the first pope, but we actually do have positive evidence that Paul seems to recognize the presence of Peter as the Bishop of Rome. Now, a fifth target that we could respond to, recall that some Protestants will often argue that Paul's comment in 2 Timothy 4, 6 through 11, that only Luke remained with him in his last days, is evidence that Peter was not the Bishop of Rome. And so we can respond to this and ask the question, does this show that Peter wasn't with him in Rome? If Paul is saying only Luke remained with him, does that show that Peter was not with him in Rome and thereby not the Bishop of Rome and thereby not the first pope? Well, in response, Paul is not saying that all Christians left him alone. He only speaks of his assistants in the ministry, Demas, Crescens, and Titus. Demas was a fellow worker with Paul, according to Philemon 24. Paul calls him a fellow worker. Titus was the famous quote-unquote partner and quote-unquote fellow worker with Paul, according to 2 Corinthians 8:23, to whom Paul writes an epistle. Although Crescens is unknown, we can reasonably infer that he was also one of Paul's assistants, given the fact that his name appears in a list of names that were assistants to Paul, including Luke. Since Paul is only referring to his assistants in the ministry, his exclusion of Peter as not being with him wouldn't count as evidence that Peter wasn't in Rome, because Peter wasn't a member of Paul's circle of fellow workers. So again, just because Paul says only Luke remained with him in his last days and excludes Peter, that doesn't mean Peter was not there in Rome or the Bishop of Rome. Now, secondly, even if we concede for argument's sake that Paul was saying there were no apostolic figures with him in an absolute sense, it doesn't prove Peter was never in Rome, because there's evidence that Peter was already dead at the time Paul penned this letter to Timothy. Paul wrote his letter either the summer or early fall of the year he died, which was AD 67. There's evidence that Peter died before Paul, sometime around AD 65 or 66, according to Pseudo-Abdius in the Passion of St. Paul, and also Augustine's Sermons 295. If Peter died before Paul penned this letter, well then we have a plausible explanation as to why Paul doesn't mention him. Namely, he's dead. So like the other references, Paul's lack of reference to Peter in his farewell address in 2 Timothy 4, 6-11 fails also as evidence against Peter being in Rome. So just recall, the general argument here is that the New Testament, and particularly Paul, does not mention Peter or the Petrine office or Peter's association with the Church of Rome whenever it would have been pertinent to do so. So it's an appeal to silence here, but the argument is saying that it's not just silence, it's silence within places where you would think Paul would mention Peter. And so for example, Paul's list of different ministries in the church in 1 Corinthians 12, apostles, prophets, teachers, etc. You would think Paul would mention Peter if Peter were the first pope. Since he doesn't, that means Peter wasn't the first pope. Well, we responded and said, hey, listen, those lists are not intended by Paul to be exhaustive. There are other places where Paul, in Romans 12, includes other ministries, leaves out some, and so just because he doesn't mention Peter as the chief royal steward or the Petrine office, it doesn't follow that Peter wasn't the first pope. Some Protestants will argue that Paul's lack of reference to the office of the papacy in his letter to the Romans is evidence that Peter wasn't the first pope. And then in response, we said, well, number one, Paul's letters were restrictive, and so we can't expect him to be including everything that pertains to the Christian faith. And then secondly, the content of Paul's letters had to do with issues of those local churches. So Paul's lack of reference to the Petrine office would only prove possibly that it wasn't an issue of conflict. And so it wasn't necessary to include it in his letter because he simply didn't have to deal with it. Protestants also argue that Paul's lack of address to Peter in association with the Church of Rome and doesn't even address Peter in his letter to the Romans would be evidence that Peter wasn't in Rome or wasn't the Bishop of Rome. And then we responded to that and said, hey, listen, we got plausible explanations as to why Paul wouldn't address Peter in his letter to the Romans. One possible reason is that maybe Peter wasn't the Bishop of Rome yet. That's at least an alternative explanation. And then secondly, we know from Peter's first letter that he traveled throughout various regions, and so possibly Peter wasn't there whenever Paul was penning his letter to the Romans. And then we looked at the message of the preaching of the gospel to the Church of Rome in Romans 1:15. We gave some responses to that. And finally, Protestants argued that Paul's comment that only Luke remained with him in his last days only proves that Paul was referring to his assistants. Thereby, the lack of mentioning of Peter doesn't prove that Peter was not in Rome. So, my friends, we've looked at two challenges to Peter as the first pope in today's episode. James headed the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15. Secondly, the New Testament never mentions the office of the papacy when it would have been pertinent to do so. And we have given reason why these challenges do not succeed in disproving Peter as the first pope. Thanks for listening to The Catholic Reason, a production of St. Michael Catholic Radio based in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. You can download the show through whichever podcast platform you use by subscribing to the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast. You can access the archived episodes at karlobroussard.com under the audio tab. I invite you to join me again next week for The Catholic Reason as we continue looking at Catholic claims and the reasons behind them. Tell a friend. I'll talk to you then. God bless.